Everybody, welcome to the video. It's Saturday, July 31st, and we're breaking down both slates that we have over on DraftKings today. We have a 5-game early slate that starts around 4 p.m. Eastern. Then we have the 9-game main slate tonight that starts around its normal time at 7 o'clock. And I will say both these slates do look pretty rough. There is some decent pitching, but the bats are kind of hard to find, especially in the late slate tonight. So we'll try to sift through it and find some plays that we like, but I will tell you right now it's looking a little bit slim at some positions today. But if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I do cover other sports as well besides MLB, like the NFL and NASCAR, and we have NFL coming up in just about a month, so there'll be plenty of content coming out on the channel. If you don't follow me over on social media, you know to find me using the handles in the bottom hand corner of your screen. And if it helps for the channel over on Patreon, get access to some extra content, you can do that using the link down below. Although I would wait until Sunday, as it is the first of the month, and that's when you get your best bang for your buck. Last but not least, this video is sponsored by Prize Picks. I'm sure most of you know what it is by now, but if you don't, it's daily fantasy sports simplified, just you versus the projections. There's no sharks, 150 max contests, or salary cap restrictions, just you versus the props that they offer each and every single day. And if you look hard enough, you can find some pretty soft lines to take advantage of. And as of right now, if you're a new signee over on Prize Picks, you can get a free money bonus up to $100. That's an instant deposit match up to $100, so it's free money. Why not use it to your advantage when you use code CPEN and tell them I sent you? But I think that's it for the plugs for the most part, so without further ado, let's dive into today's video. And as per usual, we'll start with the pitchers and move on to the bats. And I'm going to have both slates mixed in here, but we're going to start with the late slate because there's 3 in a row here, and they're all kind of expensive pitching options. But I was looking at the cheap guys on the main slate, and there is pretty much nothing to like. So if you're playing the late slate today, I think you're going to have to spend it for pitching here. But these guys aren't overly expensive. Like Darvish, yeah, $10,500, but then Woodruff and Nola are both below 10K, and there's plenty of cheap bats to pick from here, so it shouldn't be too hard to double spend up today. But we'll start up top with Darvish, $10,500, and I know he hasn't been great in recent form. I know his last matchup versus Miami, it was a smash spot. He was like 85% in cash games, ended up struggling in that game. So here we go, back again, another Darvish chalk night. I would assume he's going to be by far the highest owned pitcher on the slate here. A very low implied team total against him, below 3 here. Pretty heavy favorite, 6.5K prop, and he's playing the Rockies on the road, which we can always target pitchers when they're facing the Rockies away from Coors Field, especially if you're a righty, because if you're looking at the splits this season for the Rockies away from Coors, I realized they went off last night, but to be fair, I guess they did start versus a lefty, but even then their numbers versus lefties, especially away from Coors, aren't that great, and even Trevor Story sat as well, so that was kind of a crazy game there. And last night was just a crazy slate overall. Like Corbin Burns ended up turning into mush, and the Detroit Tigers versus Matt Harvey got pretty much mowed down, and it was just a very interesting slate overall. So hopefully there's not a repeat of that tonight. But if we're looking at the Rockies versus Righties this season, they only have a 23% K rate, but a 71 WRC plus. And if you're wondering whatever the heck WRC plus is, kind of like the standards around 100, so they're very below average there. 297 WOBA, 142 Team ISO, and even some of those numbers can get inflated from Coors Field, but WRC plus does take that into account. So versus Righties this season, you can definitely use pitchers against them. And Joe Musgrove, a guy that hasn't really been in great recent form, ended up having like 10 or 11 strikeouts versus the Rockies on Thursday night, and ended up having like 35 fantasy points, something like that. So I think Darvish, even though he hasn't been pitching great, should have a good game here versus Colorado. And if we're looking at his numbers on the season, about a 29% K rate, doesn't really walk too many guys. 3.86 xFIP, which is a little bit up there, but a 3.5 Sierra, and I think he'll be just fine in this matchup. So definitely like Darvish as the SP1 on the main slate tonight, but I will say he has not been in great recent form recently, so hopefully it just doesn't continue here, but at some point it's going to turn around. Then dropping down to, I guess, our SP2s in the main slate here, we have either Brandon Woodruff or Aaron Nola. As of right now, I'm leaning Aaron Nola just because Pittsburgh's an overall softer matchup, and looks like it's going to be some pretty hitter-friendly weather over in Atlanta. It was last night, but I still wasn't overly concerned about it because of how good Corbin Burns is, but the guy was just terrible last night. Started off awful, kind of righted the ship for a little bit where he got a bunch of strikeouts in a row and limited the runs after that, but after a terrible first inning, it's kind of hard to overcome that fantasy points-wise. But I think Brandon Woodruff, assuming that doesn't happen to him here, yeah, he might give up a couple runs, but I think the strikeouts should be there. It's a team that will strike out over 25.5% of the time versus Righties, and plus, no Ronald Acuna does help some things. Now, he does strike out a little bit, so when you take him out of the equation, maybe that helps in some way, because Jock Peterson, lefty and righty matchup there leading off versus Brandon Woodruff, but I mean, I think he should be able to get you around 20 fantasy points here. It's not overly expensive. Team total below 4 against him is a slight favorite, 7.5K prop, and his numbers on the season have been excellent. A real nice ERA, xFIP and Sierra, both around 3. The xFIP's below 3, Sierra's just a little bit above that, but a 30.5% K rate. Doesn't really walk many guys, limits the power, less than a 100 ISO given up in the season, and only a 25% hard contact rate, and about a half a homer per 9. Kind of similar numbers to Corbin Burns, and he kind of got mashed yesterday, so we'll have to be a little bit careful here, especially with the hitter-friendly weather in Atlanta, but I still think Woodruff is a fine option, but I think I'd prefer Nola over him, but it is very, very close. And speaking of Nola, $9,700, you can save $100 here, and he gets a very soft matchup here versus the Pittsburgh Pirates in a pitcher-friendly park in Pittsburgh. He has 3.27 implied team total against him, which is the second lowest on the slate, only behind Yu Darvish. Very heavy favorite, 7K properties coming off an excellent game versus the Atlanta Braves, a team we just got done talking about, where he nearly had a complete game shutout. He would have had close to 50 points in that game if he didn't give up that homer. I believe it was to Austin Riley at the very end of the game. He was so close to having the complete game shutout, which is always a nice little bonus over on DraftKings, but I can't complain about a 37-point game. Hopefully he takes that momentum here to Pittsburgh, and his numbers on the season kind of similar to the other pitchers that we just talked about, but a 3.41 xFIP, 3.3 Sierra, 29% carry, doesn't really walk too many guys. He does give up a little bit of pop though, 185 ISO, which is actually more than Yu Darvish here, but Pittsburgh is a team that really lacks power in their offense. Like if we're looking at their splits versus righties this season, they only have a 135 ISO, 89 WRC plus, and they don't really strike out too much, only 21.9% of the time, so maybe this won't be the biggest strikeout game here for Aaron Nola, but I think he's going to be able to limit the runs, probably get 6, 7 plus strikeouts here, and be an overall solid option below $10,000. I do think he's a pretty good play today. Then dropping down to the early slate pitchers here, there's absolutely nothing I like up top. Yes, there's Zach Greinke. You have Alex Wood. They're fine pitchers, but I don't really love the matchups for them. So I just kind of picked some mid-range guys and decent matchups here. So we'll start with Nathan Eovaldi, $8,200. Not my favorite pitcher to ever use, especially versus a Tampa team that has been hitting the ball well recently. And they do have plenty of pop versus righties, but Nathan Eovaldi has been pitching pretty solid recently. His numbers aren't going to wow you here, but at his price point in a pitcher-friendly park in Tampa Bay, I think he is somewhat viable here. 3.5 xFIP. The Sierra's a little bit higher at 3 3/4, but close to a 24% carry, doesn't really walk too many guys. Limits the power of the 120 ISO, gets a good amount of ground balls, only a 25% hard contact rate allowed, and less than half a homer per 9. And he usually pitches in a hitter-friendly park in Fenway. So this is definitely a good park shit from going to the Trop. If we're looking at the splits this season for Tampa versus righties, they will strike out quite a bit, over 25.5% of the time. But they do walk a lot. They got a lot of power, a 109 WRC plus. So there is some risk here, but Eovaldi's a guy that can limit the power. He's been pitching well. Can get a handful of strikeouts here, so $8,200. I think he is viable, and only a 4 implied team total against him. Then John Means, $8,000. So I'm not overly confident in Means here. He hasn't exactly looked amazing this season. And Detroit's a team that has been hitting the ball well recently. I know they kind of sucked last night, but as soon as Baltimore put a lefty in the pen in the game, that's when they started their comeback where they scored 3 runs. But John Means, I mean, he should be okay. He limits the hard contact. The one problem with him is that he gives up power and fly balls. He's got a 50% fly ball rate in the season and close to 2 homers per 9. So if we're going to use anybody versus John Means, I don't mind some of the righties on Detroit. I think they make for some good power one-off plays, but I'm not really looking to stack Detroit here. And on the season, John Means, sporting a good ERA below 3, but his xFIP and Sierra are about 2 runs higher. An okay 23% carry, doesn't really walk too many guys, and like I said, he gives up a little bit of pop and some fly balls, which is always an issue, but Detroit's not the most hitter-friendly park in baseball. If this was in Camden Yards, I definitely have more concerns here. And overall this season, I know I mentioned that Detroit is hitting the ball well recently, and they do have some guys on the team that can hit left-handed pitching for some power. But overall this year versus lefties, they haven't been that great. They do strike out quite a bit. A 27.2% K rate, 95 WRC plus. The WOBA and OBP are okay, but only 149 team ISO. So I think Means at his price point is a viable pitcher. Plus the early slate pitching options do look pretty gross, so I do think he is in play. Then if you want a cheap option here, we have Domingo Armand, $6,500 coming off a great game. Now he gets another good spot here versus Miami, which if you're looking at their current lineup, it looks pretty rough. They lost Adam Duvall, they lost Starley Marte. I know they got Jazz back recently, but this is a very bad offense right now. And it's one of the best places to pitch in all of baseball in Miami. Definitely a nice park shift there from Yankee Stadium to the Marlins place. And if we're looking at his numbers on the season, obviously they're not going to look that great. And he's a guy that can give up some power, over a 200 ISO given up this season. But a 4.29 xFIP, 4 Sierra, 23.5% carry, doesn't really walk too many guys. At his price point, I think he's fine. If we're looking at the Marlins splits this season versus right-handed pitching, only a 136 team ISO, 294 WOBA, 87 WRC plus, and about a 25.5% K rate. And plus they lost 2 of their better bats. So definitely think at $6,500 he is in play, but I don't have much confidence in it. But I guess that makes up for it with the price tag that he has. But I think that'll be it for the pitching for the most part, so we can move right over to the bats. And as far as the offenses go today, there's not a whole lot to love here. So we're kind of having some slim pickings, but I think there's a couple teams that we can certainly target tonight on both slates. And we'll start up top with the catcher position as always, and we have Eric Haas here at $5,200. Very, very expensive. And I just got done talking up John Means as a somewhat viable play here, not in love with him. But if we're going to use anybody versus Means here, we're going to want some power righties. And Eric Haas, he has been amazing in limited times this season so far versus left-handed pitching. Smaller sample size here, around 70 plate appearances, but he's got a 426 ISO, a 200 WRC plus, over an 1100 OPS, and a 41% hard contact rate with a 340 batting average. So if you're going to use anybody versus John Means, Eric Haas is near top of the list, but you are going to have to pay a pretty penny for him. And then dropping down to Will Smith here, $4,900 for the LA Dodgers. And like I was saying, there's not a whole lot to like from offense, especially from the late slate today. Like, there's only a couple teams that I have even a little bit of interest here, and the Dodgers are one of them. And we're going against Merrill Kelly, who has not been a bad pitcher this season, but he will struggle with hard contact, and this is just overall pretty good offense. Now, I know we are missing quite a few guys. Looks like Corey Seager's going to get the day off. There's no Mookie Betts. So yeah, it's a little bit watered down here, but they still have a team total above 5 here, and Will Smith's one of the best hitting catchers in baseball. Merrill Kelly is a guy that will struggle with hard contact, plus they're on the road, so you get those guaranteed nothing at bats, which can always help a little bit. And then Manny Pena here, $2,500. Going up against Kyle Muller, who I don't think is a bad pitcher. He's had a good strikeout rate so far, but it's still a smaller sample size. It looks like it's going to be very hitter-friendly weather in Atlanta, hot and muggy this time of the season. And Pena's got some decent pop versus lefties, and that's really the only thing that he does well, except for some power versus lefties. And at that price point, I think he is viable. I know it's only a 4.5 implied team total here, but I mean, there's just a lack of good options on the late slate today, so I do have a lot of interest in Milwaukee, even though I don't really love the matchup here. Then dropping down to first base, we have a couple of Oakland guys that are on the early slate today, but Oakland looks like by far the best offense today if you combine both slates. They get a good matchup here versus Jaime Barria, which he doesn't have a big sample size this year, but he's actually walking more guys than he's striking out, and he gives up power, and he's just not that very good of a pitcher. And it's a hitter-friendly park in LA, and it's definitely a good park shift going from Oakland to LA, so do like the Oakland A's here quite a bit. Matt Olson, he's been one of the better hitters in baseball this season with a 300 ISO, 400 WOBA, a 285 batting average. It gets a bit overlooked because he plays on Oakland, but they just traded for Starley Marte, and this offense does look pretty good today, so do like the Oakland A's bats quite a bit. Mitch Moreland, kind of the same thing as Matt Olson, obviously not quite the numbers, but he does hit for power versus right-handed pitching. Then Matt Beaty, $2,100. So if you want to afford expensive pitching on the late slate tonight, you're going to have to find some value options, so why not just take a cheap guy who's like pretty much free at $2,100 on one of the best offenses on the slate. So Matt Beaty, I know he's not a great hitter or anything, but just a cheap left and righty matchup here versus Merrill Kelly. And then dropping on second base here, we have Jonathan Scope, $4,400, similar to Eric Haas, where I said if you're going to use anybody versus John Means, you want power righties that have some good pop versus lefties, and Jonathan Scope is definitely a guy that profiles exactly like that. Because if we're looking at his splits this season versus left-handed pitching, he's got a 337 batting average, over a 400 WOBA, a 250 ISO, and close to 1,000 OPS, and a 45.3% hard contact rate. So if anybody's going deep here on Detroit, I think Jonathan Scope and Eric Haas are definitely the two top guys for that. And then Cesar Hernandez, $3,500, expected to be in the lineup here for the White Sox, and coincidentally, he's going up against his old team in Cleveland. So if you like a good narrative, I think Cesar is a decent play here, only $3,500, has shown some decent pop this season. So versus lefties, but he's facing his old teammate here, Tristan McKenzie, and he's a guy that does have a decent K rate, but he walks a lot of guys. He gives up a lot of power, lots of fly balls, and some hard contacts. So I don't think the White Sox are a bad stack today. They have a team total close to 5, and they're one of the rare offenses that do look somewhat viable on the late main slate tonight. Then Josh Van Meter, $2,900. They haven't named a starter yet for LA. DraftKings currently has it as Mitch White, but we could see pretty much a bullpen game here. So we'll have to see how that goes. But he's dirt cheap, potentially leading off here, left and righty matchup. Don't hate the idea of going to Van Meter. Does have some decent pop versus righties. And then dropping down to third base here, we have Yoan Moncada, $4,800. Like I was mentioning, the White Sox actually look like a somewhat viable stack on this slate. That's something I really love here, but they do have a team total close to 5, and Tristan McKenzie is a guy that will struggle with power. And on the season, Moncada doesn't really have too much power so far, but he's got a close to a 400 OBP. We know he walks quite a bit, 275 batting average, and a 361 WOBA. Plus, he went deep yesterday. Maybe he keeps the good times rolling, but I was struggling to find any third baseman that I liked on either slate today, so this is not one of my favorite positions at all. Then Matt Chapman, $4,700, just more power here versus Barria, and I think the Oakland A's are definitely one of the top stacks on. I'd say in the early slate, they're definitely the top stack overall. For sure, they do have the highest implied team total, and it's a great matchup versus the Angels, and their bullpen's not that great either. And if you want a dirt cheap option here, we have Asdrubal Cabrera, $2,700 here, so it's just another lefty and righty matchup here versus Mitch White, assuming he is the starter, but we'll have to wait and see on that. Then dropping down to shortstop, we have Tim Anderson, $1,500, super expensive, but like I said, the White Sox do look like a decent stack versus Tristan McKenzie. Not a guy that hits for a ton of power, but he is a decent batting average guy with over a 300 average on the season. Then Willy Adames, $4,900. He's been playing pretty good baseball ever since going to Milwaukee, which makes sense because, you know, hitting in the Trop is just one of the worst places to ever hit. And then when you go to a hitter-friendly park like Milwaukee, and now he's playing in Atlanta today, which looks like it's going to be really good hitting conditions. It's a good hitter's park as well. Gets a righty and lefty matchup here. Don't think he's a bad play whatsoever on the season, boasting over a 200 ISO, and he's got some pretty good splits versus lefties. And then if you want a shortstop on the early slate, there was pretty much nothing at all that I liked. You could go to Carlos Correa. He's only $4,000, but I don't like the matchup versus Alex Wood. But if you want a cheap guy, you have Ramon Urias at $3,000 versus Matt Manning. I don't think Matt Manning's the worst thing in the world, but he's still just kind of a newer pitcher where he's going to struggle at times, and he hasn't exactly been great this season. I mean, if we're looking at strikeout numbers, they've kind of been non-existent for the most part. I know in his last start, he was like around 10 to 12% for his strikeout rate. He's now sitting at 11.7 with a 6 ERA, a 5.5 xFIP, and a 5.5 SIERA. Also walking about 8% of the batters that he's facing, giving him a 275 batting average and a 162 ISO, and a decent amount of hard contact as well. I don't have many Orioles listed here, but if you do want to stack them up, I wouldn't hate the idea of that. They have a lower implied team total of around 4.5 here, but guys like Cedric Mullins, Austin Hayes, Anthony Santander, Trey Mancini, and Ryan Mountcastle, I think they're all viable options today. And if we were just talking about the early slate, I would definitely have those guys listed on here, but since we're kind of combining both slates, I left them off because they don't grade out extremely well for me when you combine both slates today. And then if we're dropping down to the outfield, we have Starley Marte, $5,100, brand new to the Oakland A's, but their stack looks really juicy tonight. We know Marte is a good hitter, batting around 300 this season with a 151 ISO and close to a 400 OBP. And I just overall like this team quite a bit today, so do like Marte if you are stacking up the A's. He is a little bit expensive though. Cody Bellinger, $4,900. He has been pretty terrible this season, only batting 162 with a 122 ISO. But like I said, there is a lack of good offensive options on the late slate today, so we're kind of grasping at straws here. But Bellinger, I mean, he's on one of the better stacks that we have with the 5.2 implied team total. Mark Canha, $4,800, kind of a similar play to Starley Marte here, but I'm just a fan of all of the Oakland A's on this slate. And then dropping down to some cheaper options here, we have Avasale Garcia, $3,800. He's a guy that has pop versus left-handed pitching, and the Milwaukee Brewers are one of my favorite stacks on the late slate tonight. And if this was like a normal slate where there's a lot of good options, I probably wouldn't be too interested in Milwaukee today because Kyle Muller has boasted a good strikeout rate so far. But like I said, limited options, and he's just a guy that's got some pop versus lefties, and it looks like we're going to have some pretty good hitting conditions tonight in Atlanta. Then Justin Upton, $3,200 on the opposite side of the game where I have a lot of interest in the Oakland A's. I think Upton does make some sense here versus Cole Irvin, the lefty, because Upton has shown some decent splits, shown some decent pop versus left-handed pitching this season, over a 200 ISO, so I think at that price point, he definitely becomes in play. Then we have a couple of Milwaukee outfielders here in Lorenzo Cain and Tyrone Taylor. If I had to pick one, I'm probably going to side with Taylor here. He's $1,000 cheaper. He hits higher in the order, and it's a smaller sample size this season of only 176 plate appearances, but he hasn't been that bad with over a 200 ISO and over a 340 WOBA, decent pop versus lefties, so I think he's certainly in play at that price point. Then we have a couple of dirt cheap options here in Rafael Ortega and Andrew Stevenson. Both guys are hitting higher in the order just because their teams got decimated because of the trade deadline. The Cubs lost Chris Bryant, Javier Baez, Chas McCormick, and Anthony Rizzo. And the Nationals lost Trey Turner. I know Max Scherzer doesn't hit or anything, but I mean, I guess he does at the bottom of the order here and there. But their offense didn't get as gutted, but they still lost Josh Harrison, Yan Gomes, and Starling Castro got hit with the suspension. So, yeah, both teams kind of got gutted here. Can't really expect a super high-scoring game here. I almost put Joe Ross on here just because of how bad the Cubs lineup is right now, but I was kind of worried about how deep he'd work into the game because I recently returned from injury. But if you want a cheaper option, I think Joe Ross could become in play, but Ortega just a cheap left and righty matchup here, and he is batting 275 on the season. Andrew Stevenson, he is free. He is leading off versus Kyle Hendricks. He's not a guy that gives up a ton of power, and Andrew Stevenson isn't exactly the greatest hitter in the world, but Hendricks does kind of spray a lot of hits each and every single start, so I think Stevenson, if he gets a hit or two, or maybe just a double and a run, he can pay off his price point at only $2,000. But with that being said, guys, I think that'll be it for the video, so I hope it was helpful, and if it was, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Lots of content to come for other sports. NASCAR has taken a 2-week break, but we are back next week, so we have that to look forward to. Then we have NFL coming up very, very soon, so a lot to be excited about. Definitely looking forward to it. Follow me over on social media if you feel like you want to, And if you want to help support the channel over on Patreon, you get access to a lot of extra content, because when you sign up on the first for Patreon, that's the best time to do so. And don't forget, this video was sponsored by Prize Picks. I'm sure most of you know what it is by now, but if you don't, it's daily fantasy sports simplified, just you versus the projections. And as of right now, you can get a free money bonus up to $100 when you use code CPEN and tell them I sent you. So either go to prizepicks.com or use the link down below. But I think that'll be pretty much it for the video. I will stop rambling, and I hope you guys enjoy the start to your weekend.